You're here for the home stretch. And we have 3 more presentations. We have Adele Goldberg now, then Steve Piantadosi, and then Dan Everett will finish with a few remarks. Okay, so thank you, Adele.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Ted, for organizing this incredible event. And Dan, thank you for everything you've done. This work, I'm not going to tax your thinking abilities. I think for this work, it's going to be based on English and kind of a fun construction in English. So I like to usually start out by just asking, what are people trying to do? And it's clear, I think, when you ask, what are people trying to do with respect to language, it's clear that we need to understand messages given the forms that are witnessed for the sake of comprehension. And we also need to choose forms given our intended message for the sake of production. And the other thing that we intend to do is we want to conform to the conventions of our community or communities. And given that simple idea, it's clear that what we need to learn and use are constructions, where constructions are simply defined to be learned pairings of form and function. So by function, I have in mind both meaning and information structure, and it's been great that we've heard a lot about information structure today. And of course, ordinary sentence patterns are constructions, and they're something I've long been interested in. I'm not going to talk about them today, but argument structure patterns are constructions that encode basic scenes of experience, and questions, relative clauses, topicalization, convey discourse functions. They capture different aspects of information structure. And I'm also very interested in those. But what construction grammarians are most well known for, I think, are niche constructions. And it's not because we don't care about the ordinary constructions, it's really because the niche constructions are often a lot more fun. So they convey speaker's attitude, they can convey humor, and so on. So one example is the English gossip construction. And this is a construction that is used to express a speaker's attitude towards somebody's behavior. So if I say, it's blank of you to be here, one word will pop into your mind if you're an American English speaker, and that's likely to be nice. If you're British English, it might be good. So you know that that's the most frequent word occurring in the construction. So it's nice of you to be here accounts for about 67% of what American speakers come up with. But the construction is often said sarcastically, and it has a range of meanings. It's not always or necessarily positive. But nice is the most frequent word occurring in the construction. So speakers are aware of the conditional probabilities of what words have occurred in what constructions. So notice that here's an example where it's a little more snarky. So it's crazy of him to give more talks. Not talking about anyone here. But you wouldn't say it's tall of you to reach the top shelf. That isn't, being tall is not something you can gossip about. You're not evaluating anyone. You can say it's big of you to reach the top shelf, but in that case, it means something different than large. It has to mean it's evaluative, so it has to mean that it's generous of you to reach the top shelf. And it has to be about something animate, so you wouldn't say it's good of this building to be so comfortable. Okay, so it really is used to convey gossip. But what I'm going to focus on today is a different construction, which Shahar Schertz and I like to call the phrase as lemma, or the PAL construction. And you'll see why we like to call it the PAL construction. Other people refer to it as a phrasal compound construction, but that's actually not a good name for it. So here are a few examples. You can see if you can guess the linguist that I'm referring to here. So this is not. So I hope what I have to say won't offend the I love lexical rules crowd, or language is much too important to be reduced to a bunch of trivial don't do this prescriptions by a couple of, I can't tell when I've broken my own misbegotten rules, bumbles. Where's Jeff? That's a yes. That IQ is meaningful bullshit, Steve. Here's to our recursion is overrated host. And our favorite, I'm a hillbilly who dropped out of high school to be a cowboy, a Christian missionary who became an atheist, and an academic who left tenure to join an endangered language foundations guy. So you get the idea. We're sticking a whole phrase, sometimes a whole sentence, in a slot, in quotes here. So it's a phrase, but we're treating it as if it's a word or a word root, a lemma. So the internal syntax can be a full sentence, it can be a request. That's pretty much the please don't dump me dance, isn't it? Or a vocative, so this is no stately, hey, everybody look at me procession. It can be a WH question, complete with subject auxiliary inversion, like a why am I me question. Okay, so we can ask, so people have looked, these linguists tend to get very upset when they look at these. These don't make a lot of sense. They violate the idea that you can't have syntax inside of words. But taking a page from Dan, I think we should look the unusual in the eye, stare it down, and accept it for what it is. But it had been proposed that maybe we can treat these pals, these phrase as lemmas, as if they're just nouns. Let's put them through the lexical rule mill and treat it as a noun. But if it were a noun, then you would expect that it could be recursive on the right side, like a Thursday afternoon talk in a compound. But that doesn't really work with these pals. You wouldn't say, I have a dream speech recording. Instead, what you'd say is a recording of the I have a dream speech, right? So you wouldn't embed it the way nouns can be embedded. It doesn't matter. In any case, the lexical rule account won't work because these phrases as lemmas don't have to be in noun compounds. They can be adverbs like this is the hides the dirt brown sweater, or it came from outer space odd. They can be predicative adjectives, as in Romney's slogan should be more I'm nothing like you. It could be full MPs, as in today in linguists are not kidding when they say that language enables you to understand sentences that have never been said before in the entirety of human history. Right, so you're treating that whole phrase as a noun phrase. As verbs, don't you be yes ma'aming me, okay, or as adjectives like she has done a much more I'm compassionate to campaign. So trying to say that these phrases are actually some lexical category like nouns or adjectives or verbs is really trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. So let's ask, why do we do this? So another taking a page from Dan is we're going to ask, what's the function of this? Why do we use phrases as lemmas? Okay, so one account has been suggested, and that was simply to point out that these pals, when they're in compounds, are used to characterize a generic type of entity that's named by the noun, or to identify a specific noun referent. You don't need to think too hard about those. It's true, but it's true of all modifiers. So all modifiers serve those purposes. That doesn't make them special. So we still haven't answered, why are we sticking a phrase in a word slot? Why do people do that? So these other interpretations are typical for simple adjectives, for example. Okay. So we've seen that not all pals are modifiers, and it doesn't capture what's special about pals. What is special about the pals function? Okay, so here's a clue. Pals often seem to be witty. Okay, so maybe my examples weren't witty, but we have some experimental evidence I'll explain. Why are they witty? Well, the form of a construction is, it's a phrase, even a sentence, is treated as if it were a word root. And then we can ask, well, what do word roots do? Word roots, or lemmas, convey familiar, recognizable meaning. Otherwise, you wouldn't use it, right? You use a word root, you assume that your community understands what you mean. And that turns out to be important. So word meanings have to be name-worthy, as Marianne Methuen, who we heard from earlier, had said a long time ago. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a word root for that. So the frame semantic, the lexical meanings of word roots have to be coherent, recurring, familiar among the lemma-using community. So the idea is this, that the construction treats a phrase as if it were a word root. That's just obvious from its distribution. Word roots are lemmas. Lemmas evoke familiar recurring semantic frames. That's what they do. So pals convey a type of event or situation that the speaker expects the listener to be familiar with. That is, by pretending it's a lemma, you're assuming you're treating as if it's familiar to the listener. And comedians have a term for this. They call it observational humor. It involves talking about familiar events that are not usually talked about. So novel pals, phrases as lemmas, express events that are presumed to be familiar, that are not often talked about, and that's why they're witty. So what is observational humor? It's the kind of jokes that start with, have you ever noticed, or did you ever wonder why? And I would love to play the Jerry Seinfeld for you, but I guess we don't have time. But he's famous for doing this. Okay, fine.
We use it much as a phone, do we? No, we don't, because they gave us the option. Some years ago, you were given the option. Well, you want to communicate to another person. You could talk, you could type. Well, once you had that option, well, that took half a second. Talking lost. Talking's over. Who wants to talk? Oh, my God, I got to talk. Do I have to talk to this person now? Talking is work. You got to make facial expressions that go with what you're saying, different hand gestures. You got to suck air in. You got to blow it out. Talking is over. It's obsolete. It's antiquated. I feel like a blacksmith up here sometimes, to tell you the truth.
Okay, so instead we text, right? The speaker who uses a novel pal is inviting the listener to treat the named situation as if it were familiar. And how did we get evidence for this? We simply asked people, naive speakers, both a pal example and a paraphrase without a pal. So we asked people, a speaker which uses which of these sentences seems to assume more shared background with the listener? We didn't know if people would even understand the question, but then they're comparing things like, don't treat me like you are the big sister, versus don't give me that I'm a big sister attitude. Okay, so they mean roughly the same things, but which one seems to presume more familiarity with the listener? Here's another example, same question. She was busy singing, dancing, and doing the "it's Britney, bitch" thing in preparation for her summer tour, versus she is busy singing, dancing, and proudly saying "it's Britney, bitch" in preparation for her summer tour. So which presumes more familiarity? Out of the items, I don't remember how many items we have, the same numbers of dots, people do reliably judge the PAL examples to assume more familiarity with the listener. Okay. We also asked people, just to confirm, that people do judge them to be more witty. These weren't particularly funny ones. These were simple things like, I'll give you the PAL example. The instructions were like a use your imagination thing. It was not particularly witty, but compared to the only instructions were use your imagination. And people found them to be systematically more witty, the PAL examples. So people are aware of what they're doing. So PALs treat a phrase as if it were a lemma to presuppose shared familiarity, because that's what lemmas do. So they're often quotes, the I got you line, don't mess with me stance, and quotes as, okay, sorry, I'm going to skip that. So PALs are often quotes. Quotes are powerful. We use quotes all the time. Like, so here are some inspired by Dan. And notice you don't have to quote people. You can always paraphrase them. When do you actually quote them as if you do this and you might move your body to do it? You're often making fun of them. And she said, nah, right? So that's where the sarcasm comes in. And in fact, so the quotes are not necessarily actually said. So and this is something that goes back to Garrick and Clark. Quotes can be non-serious demonstrations. You're pretending to be someone else. So when you say a woe is me approach, nobody ever says "woe is me" or "blame the victim." Nobody ever says that, but we use it as if it's a quote, or the greed is good. Okay, and so in fact, these PAL constructions, these PAL instances are recognized to be more sarcastic. That's the function of the construction. The construction is there really to express this observational humor. It's a family of constructions. Some are quite idiomatic. We remember them, but it's a network. All of our learned constructions, pairings of form and function, form a network. They're related to other form, function pairings in a language. So here you get the PAL is the daughter, the noun compound at the top, the adjective noun compound at the top. Sorry, we'll skip that. And then you have extensions. So you have PALs can be used as verbs, but much less often. So, and people recognize that the PALs before a noun are preferred. They're more prototypical, far more common. So we know that. That's part of what we know. We also know a lot of examples, like a wag the dog approach or I have a dream speech. So this, our knowledge of language is this compressed, lossy network of learned pairings of form and function that we combine on the fly. Okay, and I'll skip some of this since we're running out of time. It exists in other languages. I'm just going to mention Hebrew that hasn't been talked about, but Shahar, the co-author on this paper, noticed it's not a noun compound in this case. In Hebrew, it's instead a complement of a preposition, okay? So normally you can compare it with a simple case, I'm excited to the level of a bride, or I'm excited to the level of, in a moment, I'm going to cry here. Okay. And I think this idea of adding wittiness or by treating something that's not really a word as if it were a word is also involved in text acronyms and in using novel nouns as verbs. We're doing the same thing. We're being playful. We're inviting the listener to be our pal by, you know this word. This is familiar to us. Okay. Okay, so by paying attention to its function, which really linguists often do after the fact, but I want to encourage us to do it before, like ask, what is it doing? Why does it exist? Its function motivates its form. It coerces the interpretation of familiarity by treating it as if it's a word, which gives it its interpretation of wittiness. And that same effect can be seen in these text abbreviations where we take a whole phrase, treat it as if it's a word, or novel denominal verbs. The use of quotes encourages this sarcastic interpretation. It also explains the most frequent nouns that occur in the construction. That's what that list is. And because its function is motivated, and the function motivates its form, you see it in many languages. Not all, by any means, but you see it in some unrelated languages, including Hebrew. Okay, and because our memory is really vast, and we don't only create things on the fly, we also remember things that we've heard, it requires this usage-based approach where we remember the statistics in the input. Okay, and I give my deepest thanks to Shahar. Hopefully he's on the web. And the Laughing Out Loud work is actually in progress done by Odessa Goldberg, who's my niece. So thank you.
Peng Qian here. This is really fascinating. I was wondering to what extent these PAL constructions are picking up meanings that don't have lexical items that you can just names directly, and whether the wittiness come from the fact that you don't have a word, but now you have a better way to somewhat imagine a word.
Well, absolutely. So the idea of observational humor is to talk about things that we don't usually talk about. So these are things that we don't usually talk about. If we did talk about them often enough, there might be a word for it, but there is no word, right? Yeah, exactly. That's part of it. Right.
Hi, Caleb. Thanks, that was really awesome. I had a question about the experiment. So that was all presented in written form to everyone?
Yes.
And do you, if I could ask you to speculate, would you expect a difference if the stimuli were presented in auditory form?
I think you would still get the same judgments. There's more going on. I mean, I think it's more common in written form. It does take some planning to create them. Like they've increased in frequency, and they're often on Twitter. Twitter's very well suited for them. But they go way back. So why, did you have an intuition?
Well, no, I was just wondering if there's like, sometimes with written stimuli you get some sort of formality effect, right, where the intimacy part might be accentuated a bit, right, or the perception of that if you're willing to do it in a written form as opposed to just doing it in a normal conversation, if that makes any sense.
I bet it would. I bet it does carry over in a normal conversation. Although, if you're talking to somebody, you already know them somewhat, right? But to an audience, for example, I bet it does convey that. But yeah, we didn't use auditory stimuli. Yes.
We'll take one more.
Okay.
I'm
Sorry.
gonna move
Yep.
Steve
Sure.
in.
Okay.
You can answer.
Hi,
Okay.
Karina. This is really awesome. I was wondering, you kind of already hinted at some connection to demonstrations. So I was wondering if you had thought about like the relation between these pulse and demonstrations. So I'm thinking about like work by Kate Davidson, who studied constructions, and he was like, je t'aime versus, and he was like, I love you. Where like depending on the audience, you just like need to kind of, like the function is more to kind of convey a key aspect that is relevant to the conversation right now, but it doesn't have to be a literal quote in this sense.
It doesn't have to be a literal quote.
Yeah.
That's generally true of quotes, though. They often aren't literal. So they are used to caricature people, often. Otherwise, we often use a paraphrase and just say, she said that. But if you say, she said, da-da-da-da-da, you're pretending to be her, and it's often a demonstration of what
Because I
she's
was
like.
wondering, it seems like these demonstrations can go into very similar slots than these pals, so.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Oh, I'd love to talk to you more about that. Okay.
Thank you very much, Adele. What's your name again?
Steve Piantadosi. Okay, cool. So thank you, everybody, for sticking around till the very end. I know it's been a long day, so I figured I would start with a little demonstration, I think. So actually, we're going to have a short one-act play that we're going to read. There's 3 characters in this play. One is the narrator, which I'll read. There's also a dancer, which Ev, are you okay to read? Great. And there's a third character named Dan Everett. Is there anyone here willing to read Dan Everett? Yeah? Okay, awesome. So as the narrator, let me just set the stage here. So we're at a masquerade ball, okay? The grand ballroom is filled with elegantly dressed guests wearing intricate masks. Dan Everett, a renowned linguist, is among the crowd, his mask hiding his identity. He spots a captivating dancer across the room, gracefully gliding through the crowd. Dan musters up the courage and approaches the dancer. That's your line.
May I have this dance?
Nailed it. The dancer looks at Dan, intrigued by his request. They take Dan's hand and start to sway to the music.
Of course, I'd be delighted.
As they dance, the tension in the air is palpable. Dan can't help but bring up the topic that has consumed his academic career.
You know, I made some groundbreaking discoveries about the Pidaaha language. The lack of recursion challenges Chomsky's universal grammar theory.
The dancer pauses for a moment, surprised by Dan's bold statement. Uh-oh. Okay.
Oh, is that so? And here I thought my dance moves were the only things shaking things up tonight.
Dan chuckles. enjoying the playful banter. But as the dance continues, the conversation grows more intense.
The Pitaha language stands as evidence against universal grammar. Their culture and language defy Chomsky's claims.
Is that what you believe? How fascinating. But do you truly understand the depth and implications of your claims?
Dan's curiosity piqued. He leans closer to the dancer, eager for an enlightening conversation.
I'm open to discussion. Enlighten me then. Who might you be behind that mask?
The dancer hesitates for a moment, then removes his mask, revealing himself to be Noam Chomsky. Still you have.
Well then, it seems we have much to discuss.
Dan's eyes widen in disbelief, a mix of surprise and excitement, stammering.
Noam Chomsky here at a masquerade ball?
Indeed, the world is a small place, even when masked.
They continue dancing, their steps now perfectly synchronized. The masquerade ball becomes a stage for an intellectual battle between two prominent linguists. Fade out. Okay. So, as you might have guessed, this was written by a large language model, okay, which is the topic of the talk today. The prompt I gave it was the following. So write a short script where Dan Everett attends a masquerade ball and dances with a great dancer. They start to talk and then argue about Dan's claims about Pitaha. Eventually, the dancer removes his mask to reveal he is Noam Chomsky. Okay? And you can see that what this language model, this is ChatGPT, right, which is a giant neural network trained on a huge amount of text from the internet. What it's doing here is essentially reverse summarizing, right? So it's taking a summary and it's expanding it out into a full script. And there's a number of notable things about what it produces, but I think maybe the most notable for the current topic is that it's really good at syntax, right? So it produces a variety of different syntactic structures. It's fine with agreement. It uses pronouns in reasonable ways, right? It's very natural in terms of its language productions. You might look at it and spot, places where it could be improved, right? Maybe there's some weirdness, some things it doesn't know about how this interaction was likely to go, right? Lacking some world knowledge and things. But in terms of syntactic competence, right, it's very much like a person, right? Probably in many situations indistinguishable from the kind of syntax a person would produce. So whatever this neural network has internalized from its data, it's really internalized some kind of theory of syntax, and that's a theory of syntax that is really, really remarkable, right? It's really good at producing human-like language here. I think also it's internalized quite a bit of semantics and world knowledge. So if you compare what's in the prompt at the very bottom to the kinds of things this language model produces, there's tons of things it knows about the world. So for instance, here in red, I've highlighted a bunch of facts it knows, right? So it knows that Dan is a renowned linguist, right? It knows that at a masquerade ball, the mask hides your identity, knows that this is a topic that has consumed at least part of his academic career, what kinds of things would be surprising, and so on, right? So all of this knowledge is somehow present in text on the internet and then somehow encoded in the weights of this kind of neural network. In blue, I've also highlighted some of the kind of situational knowledge that this network has, right? So things about when people would be smiling, when they would be teasing, what kinds of interactions people would likely to have in this type of situation. So I would call those non-syntactic knowledge, but certainly in terms of syntax, it's very good. This is sort of generally true of these large language models. So modern language models are very good at explaining a huge number of different aspects of language. So there's quantitative comparisons on grammaticality judgments where they get something like 80 or 90% of them. These span a large range of different interesting linguistic phenomena, things like agreement, WH questions, pronouns, relative clauses, islands, so on. They arguably encode key parts of lexical semantics, compositional semantics. They know about idioms. They're state-of-the-art NLP for machine translation. They know about style. They know about discourse coherence, right? So it can tell a huge, long story that is coherent and following the prompt. And that especially, I think, should be impressive to people who've worked with other kinds of language models, say n-gram models or context-free grammars, which really aren't good at maintaining those types of long-range dependencies, right? These modeling techniques have figured out how to do that, as well as a whole bunch of other things. They can generate computer code, meta-linguistic reasoning. They're drawing syntactic trees and things now. There's multimodal learning models that can integrate this kind of language with things in, say, computer vision, as well as movement towards plausibly neural models, work out of Ev's lab and other people's labs. So if you contrast this with other approaches to language, for instance, generative syntax, is one I'll be talking about primarily in this talk, can capture some grammaticality judgments, maybe some typological patterns. It's always a little bit unclear to me which of those typological patterns are post hoc and which aren't, but not well integrated with processing, not well integrated with learning theories, not integrated at all with neural phenomena, and in fact sort of intentionally not connected to anything theory external, right? So anything outside of syntax itself. I think that maybe there's another way of kind of summarizing this, this contrast. So for modern language models, you get things like the script that we just read. In generative syntax, you get things that look like this. So this is a parse tree for the sentence, John likes Mary, that has 9 levels of embedding. This is according to minimalist theory in the early 2000s. Nowadays, it's, I guess, a little bit out of date in terms of the nodes and things in it, right? But the point is that it's very, very complicated, and all of the kind of pieces of it, right, so what those nodes are and where they come from, are all justified through theory internal means. So there's no behavioral evidence or neural evidence or anything like that for any of the complexity of that structure. In case people think I'm being mean and making fun of it or something, that tree is actually from a paper by Margolis and Lawrence, arguing that people should take this theory really seriously in terms of learning, right? Because it faces a real learning challenge. So it's not a cartoon picture at all of what syntax looks like in that approach. So what I think is kind of profound about these models is how they work and what kinds of principles were needed for them. In particular, in these modern neural network models, there's no innate grammar. Learning happens out of this relatively unrestricted hypothesis space. Learning demonstrably works, right? So there's quantitative measures showing that these things get better and better at say, predicting language. How they do that is they infer rich class of latent variables and processes through learning. And this class of latent variables allows interaction between past material and upcoming material, which is interactions of a pretty unrestricted form, which I'm happy to talk about later. They have a powerful capacity to memorize, so I think they're very much like kind of construction-based approaches in that they're good at memorizing chunks of language and then reusing those chunks. They have vector-based models of lexical semantics and models that integrate syntax and semantics. They are based underlyingly on kind of gradient probabilities. There's no clear sort of need for competence performance or anything like that. Okay, so pretty much every tenant of a Chomskyan approach to language, they do the opposite, and then they're very successful at all of these natural language processing tasks I went through. That doesn't mean that our linguistic theories are completely unlike these models. So for instance, there's very cool work by Chris Manning and colleagues showing that if you analyze the weights inside of these networks, they come to encode things that look like pieces of hierarchical syntax or dependency structures. Right, so some of those kinds of pieces of linguistic theory are likely things that are realized inside of the neural networks. But it's important to say, I think, that people don't have a very clear idea of what's actually going on in them. So there's not great theories of causally how all the pieces are put together. And it could be that some of these pieces are just a big mess, right? Like there's lots of free parameters because there's lots of different quirks and idiosyncrasies to language that just simply have to be memorized. So It's worth maybe going through some of the responses from generative syntax, generative syntacticians like Chomsky and colleagues to these kinds of models. Chomsky in particular has said that these tell us nothing. They've achieved 0 in terms of language understanding. I think that one thing that probably they have achieved is they've shown the plausibility of these other kinds of starting assumptions, right? So assumptions that are good at memorization, good at probability, can do a really, really good job at syntax, as well as some of these other kinds of components of language above syntax. There's been other responses. Some of these are actually responses to the paper I wrote for this conference. So this is what the Katzir one was. Neural networks aren't scientific theories or aren't explanatory. It's kind of an interesting position to take, I think. There's been for decades now people who have been arguing for these types of neural networks as scientific theories, right? People like Jeff Ellman and Jay McClellan, and charting out how they're explanatory, right? Explanatory in terms of the principles that you build into them, and how linguistic knowledge sort of emerges from those principles. People saying you can't refute an approach, so you can't refute Chomsky's approach, is, I guess, just a comment about word usage or something. There's plenty of people who talk about, for instance, the data that refutes behaviorism. That's a common thing. To my paper, actually, there's this very bizarre one by Roski and Beaumont saying it's not valid deductive logic to argue that models which act like people and fit neuroimaging data are what's going on inside of people. I guess I would agree that's true. It's not valid deductive logic, but it's probably a good scientific inference to make. There's not that many scientific inferences that are deductive logic. There's still some constructions and patterns that these models don't get, which I think is true. It's true of any syntactic theory, which is why there are still syntacticians around. There's typological patterns that are not explained, or these kinds of things can learn impossible languages. This is something that people frequently say about these models. And I think actually Dan's work in particular helps highlight that there's much more typological diversity than I think people have been willing to recognize. And that makes me very skeptical of these kinds of counter-arguments to these models, right? That's one point. The second point is that people actually succeed in learning structure outside of language, and this suggests a very general kind of structure learning mechanism. I won't go through the details of these experiments, but I'll just point to them maybe that we've been doing these very neat experiments with Chamane in Bolivia, generating simple discrete patterns. And so basically we'll show them some little prefix of a pattern. In the left-hand case, it's moving colored balls into buckets, and in the right-hand case, it's geometric shapes and colors in a linear array, and then ask them to generalize it in some way. And it turns out if you ask people to do that, including kids from this community, kids who've never been to school before, or kids who don't know simple algorithms like counting, their generalizations are very algorithmic. So in fact, you can better predict what their specific responses are by a learning model which tries to discover algorithms than a learning model which works over spaces like n-grams. Okay, so we think of this as evidence of a very general kind of structure learning mechanism that can operate on discrete sequences, even in kids who haven't had formal schooling before. And to my mind, it seems sort of nuts to think that kind of mechanism has nothing to do with language, right? That there's a very general kind of structure learning process like that is irrelevant to linguistic learning. Chomsky has pointed out these models aren't connected to phenomena of language acquisition, which I think is true. So people in language acquisition are just starting to get involved in kind of testing them. I think there's plenty of things in generative syntax which are also not connected to language acquisition as well. Maybe I'll skip that for time. I'll focus mostly, I think, on this last point, that modern language models require too much data. So ChatGPT, which I showed you at the beginning, is trained on roughly 100 to 1,000 times as much data as a kid will get, I think, from birth to 10 years old or so. Okay, and a lot of people looked at that and said, okay, that just makes them non-starters as theories of language acquisition. And I think that's actually the wrong inference to draw from them. The critical point is this require point, in that they probably don't require that much data. It happens that they've been trained on that much data because the AI companies that make these things don't care about learning on small amounts of data. But but we don't actually know how well they'll do, especially in terms of syntax, with smaller data set sizes. So currently there's a thing called the Baby LM Challenge, which is trying to train these types of models on child-size amounts of data. Hopefully we'll know something by late summer or fall about what's working well there. I will say that a student of mine, Frank Malika, did a cool kind of information theoretic analysis of how much information people acquire in the course of language learning, and showed basically that almost all of the bits of information about language a learner has to acquire are bits about semantics. They're not bits about syntax. So it's probably on the order of a few dozen to maybe 100 bits of information you have to learn about syntax, and it's a couple orders of magnitude more than that for semantics. So you might think that most of the data for these models maybe is training up the semantic side as opposed to the syntactic side. Here's some evidence for that. So this is a paper where they varied the amount of training data on the x-axis and looked at different measures of model performance on the y. So the blue curve is syntax, the purple curve is syntactic. Sorry, blue curve is syntactic, the purple curve is semantic. And the light blue curve is Winograd problems, so those are ones that involve some semantics as well as some world knowledge. And you can see that training on the order of 1 million to 10 million tokens, these models do very well on syntax. And in fact, they learn syntax faster than they learn semantics. Other data by Wilcox, Futrell, and Levy have trained these models on plausible child-size amounts of data. Here's just some results of theirs showing that after 90 million tokens, these things are good at, for example, filler gap constructions. Okay, so probably syntax is easy to learn. In thinking about responses to large language models, let me just outline 3 or 4 responses that nobody gave, which I think would have been very useful responses. I think that the main response from linguists in Chomsky's camp has been this sort of just denial that these things are useful. I think they're quite obviously useful. It would have been nice to hear things like a list of new ideas that these models convince us are now plausible for theories of language, right? Things like emergence, how useful probability is, or memorization, error-based learning, gradient methods, those kind of things. Some kind of humility, recognizing that principles and prescriptions that turned out wrong, especially learning claims. So there have been, over the years, many strong learning claims that were never about the amount of data. They were always about the logical impossibility of learning, right? How you just couldn't acquire proper syntax at all from positive data, and that's exactly what these things do. Some kind of quantitative comparison of generative syntax compared to other approaches. So for these large language models, there's syntactic benchmarks that they're evaluated on, which minimalism and other kinds of theories haven't entered into. Or maybe a real list of things that no human learner will learn, right? So that's sort of the claim about them is that they can learn things that no human will learn. It'd be very nice to know what exactly are the kind of theory-driven things that no human will learn, and what's the evidence that those human limitations aren't due to other things like processing limitations or pragmatics or memory. So, in conclusion, I think that typology and anthropology, structure learning, all of these new machine learning methods will really rewrite our thinking about language and what kinds of formalisms are appropriate for formalizing people's linguistic knowledge. I actually think of the generative syntax's response to large language models and machine learning in general is not unlike the response to Dan's work, right? So kind of reflexive rejection of these ideas in a way that I think is really harmful to understanding and scientific progress. I was actually kind of struck by this quote from Jeff Pullum's piece for this conference, talking about how the response to Dan was really a missed opportunity, right? That if people had applied their theoretical views and attention to analytical details in a collaborative spirit, considerable progress might have been made. No trustworthy linguistic insights have been gained through the interaction between Everett and his opponent since 2005. That chance has been lost, perhaps forever, okay? And I think instead, right, like what would be nice is thinking about language and linguistics as a really interdisciplinary science that's able to integrate a variety of different ideas and approaches, right? So in particular, with large language models, we have access to a set of really remarkable tools and ideas. Typology and structure learning and these other things, I think, are really critical for making progress. So I will end there.
So I'm supposed to say my name right. Esther. So one thing that I've noticed with large language models is that they do a really good job of is it? I'm just terrible with microphones. Okay. So what I've noticed is that large language models, they do a really decent job of writing, convincing sounding text. However, if you put constraints on that text, like you ask ChatGPT to do something like write, in iambic pentameter and write about, some, topic, and then also make it rhyming and constrain the number of letters per word. So this is something that as a human I can do, and I can leverage syntax. Do you have any insight on why the large language model wouldn't do that, or where the reconciliation is with, that it has actually picked up syntactic structure?
Yeah, great. So I think I'd want to clarify that I'm not one of these people who think that they do everything, right, and that they're great at all aspects of cognition, right? So I think that if you think about problems like that, or if you think about the problem that a poet faces, for example, of trying to write something in a particular form, it doesn't just come out like that often, right? Like they'll think about it and they'll revise it. There's kind of a thoughtful process that goes on behind the scenes about each of the components of writing, right? And that's not something that these models have, right? So I think it's interesting to think about architectures like them that include that ability, but that's not currently kind of built into them. So I think of them as primarily demonstrations or proofs of principle about syntax. And I would guess that the things you're pointing out are things that are not syntax in that sense. They combine syntax with other forms of reasoning and thought, which we have yet to formalize adequately, I think. Yeah, Rebecca?
Hi. Sasha Griffiths again. Hi. You said in one comment that n-grams wouldn't have got us there where GPT-3, 4 are at the moment.
Yeah.
Has that been shown? Do you believe that? Because I'm honestly saying what I'm saying now. I'm not sure. I think the amount of data that large language models ingest is in part responsible, and I think even Joshua Bengio and Jürgen Schmidhuber have said things like, if you have infinite memory, you can get these effects without having to specify what kind of learning mechanism.
Yeah, so there might be some model that's like an n-gram that effectively memorizes all of the training data. My main point was just that if you do that, n has to be very large, right? So the n-grams of 15 years ago went up to like n of 5, right? And 5-word sequences won't get you text like this. If there's some fancy smoothing, that you could do over, 1,000-word sequences or something, then maybe those kinds of things will work. Yeah. So I didn't mean it as a claim about the computational class or something of these models. I just meant in comparison to the n-grams I grew up with. So. Yeah.
I'm András Kornai. 2 remarks. One in response to your claim that these things don't do well the constraint stuff. They do it incredibly well, far superior performance to humans. I have had it translate Hungarian rhyming verse to English. Does a beautiful job. And when you call to its attention, well, maybe in this line there's an internal rhyme that you didn't capture. It will offer you a new version in which the internal rhyme is captured. You can take it through all kinds of stylistic hoops and does very, very well. So you say, I as a human can do. The most gifted translator of poetry can perhaps do, but your generic bilingual person clearly cannot do the kind of things that this now can. So I'd just like to see some kind of objective benchmark on this issue of where we are. That's just one remark. The other remark is I would like to go back to like the third or the second of your conclusion. This is indeed momentous. We can, it's not just, we can now run experiments that we couldn't possibly run. We can probe into the brain of something that is a very good proxy for human syntax, and we can actually see what activation patterns are generated. We can do microanalysis at a level that is inconceivable. You cannot put enough probes in humans to get this kind, basically you can inspect the activity of every goddamn neuron in this system. So this is clearly going to revolutionize all our thinking about the domain.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a ton of work to do in understanding how these models work, and also understanding ways in which their internal mechanisms are similar and different to people. And that's just a huge research program, I think. So, yeah.
Josh Hartshorn, this is a super cool talk. I wanted to ask you about, in sort of along the line, actually, I just want to say, I have yet to get ChatGPT to write an iambic pentameter. For the record, never the right number of syllables. But I haven't tried GPT-4. But I wanted to know about what you think, if you've been thinking about the implications for developmental science, right? Because I think, from where I sit in developmental science, we're sitting in, end of like 30-year period of increasingly believe that little kids, before they have language, have pretty complicated thoughts, right? And you were talking about, but like clearly these models are learning complicated thoughts or something that seems to look like complicated thoughts without, like entirely through language. Whereas, I think a lot of the developmental work maybe even pushes towards, at the limit, a theory where, language learning is really like learning a way of externalizing your thoughts, but the thoughts are already there. You're not necessarily learning the structure of thought from language. So that's a topic, not a question. But my question is, what do you think about development?
Yeah, I think that, if you look at this curve, and if this curve holds up across model architectures, right, it takes a lot more data than kids get to learn semantics. And I think a really plausible guess about what's going on there is that kids just learn semantics not through language, right? They learn semantics through interacting with the world. They have some innate semantics, like these models are trying to construct all of that just from text prediction. And it's pretty remarkable that they can do as well as they do on that. But people might be fundamentally different in that, they might have the purple curve and the light blue curve right away, right? Or much earlier than the syntax curve. And you can also imagine what that would do to syntax, right? That probably also then accelerates your syntactic learning. And so this is why I'm sort of less worried about the data sizes that current models have, and a little bit optimistic that human-like models will be able to do well with much less data. But it's just an empirical question, I think. So
I think we have to stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to cut off, but it is turning into night. And I'd like our last speaker today. What's her name? Dan Everett. Here he is. Dan, with some closing remarks.
Okay. Well, the first thing I want to say is obvious. Thank you to everyone who came and participated, and thank you to all the speakers who are marvelously accomplished people. Before I came here, Jeff Pullum reminded me that not only does just about everyone in the room tower above me physically, but they all tower above you intellectually. And so, that's been driven home to me today quite clearly by every speaker, and I've enjoyed hearing all of the speakers. And I especially want to thank Ted, because it's not like he doesn't have anything to do with his time. So he said, I guess I'll just organize a conference for Dan. And think back over the first time I saw Ted in 1987, which he alluded to, and he was sitting on the front row, and then we started meeting weekly about his thesis some months after that, and I realized, I said, this guy's really smart. You know, he knows, how the hell does he know all this stuff? And anyway, it was a really fun experience where I just let him tell me what he had done during the week, and said, sounds good to me. And so that was my advising role with Ted. I'm writing a biography about my intellectual hero right now, Charles Sanders Peirce, who I think was the greatest intellect who was ever produced in the United States. He was a world-class astronomer, a world-class geophysicist. He made his living as a geophysicist for over 30 years. He was the inventor of the most advanced pendulum for measuring gravity, and he was the first person to analyze the brightness of stars, and his only book was called Photometric Researches, which was all on the light emanation from stars and the mathematics to capture that. He was considered America's greatest mathematician after his father turned it over to him. His father, Benjamin Peirce, had been taught at Harvard for 50 years and was considered one of the greatest mathematicians in the world. Peirce never got a Festschrift. He died in obscurity, and he died in poverty. And so this is really a privilege for somebody of my level who reads Peirce every day and feels stupider by the day reading Peirce to get something like this. And thinking of Peirce and all the papers that have come by, Adele's paper on constructions, which I interpret as signs and culture and semiotics, and Steve's paper on what Steve's paper has shown to me as a Peircean is that Peirce said that all learning takes place by inference, and he defined inference as abduction, which he invented, which then was spoiled many years later by Gilbert Harman by calling it inference to the best explanation. Doesn't mean that at all. It's guessing. It's how to guess. Induction and deduction. And so these are the only ways that knowledge can enter our brains. And what the large language models do is show us that inference over signs, which Peirce would have predicted, is the only way, is a way of learning language. Okay, so when you can show that inference over signs, which is a Peircean approach to language, is capable of learning language, all the other objections fade. You have now got a near proof of a Peircean prediction, which is ironic because Chomsky has always called Peirce his favorite philosopher, which he seems never to have read. There are, just so many. Actually, who was the first person to use the term universal grammar? Does anybody know? I mean, some people might know, but Roger Bacon in the 13th century was the first person to talk about universal grammar. It was taken over by the modisti, and eventually it came to the United States. And who was the first person in the United States to develop a theory of universal grammar? In 1865, calling it universal grammar was Charles Peirce. And Peirce's universal grammar was intended to be universal. It was intended to account for languages, not necessarily. Well, he was also the first experimental psychologist in the United States in U.S. history, and he introduced a friend of his to psychology called William James. And William James got a hall named for him at Harvard, and Peirce was banned from Harvard because he snorted cocaine, and he slept around a lot, and he was arrogant as hell. And so it sounded like me in some ways, but I was never banned from any place. Well, I'm banned from the linguistics department, but that's probably not true either. But so universal grammar can be different ways. Peirce's universal grammar was the logic of semiotics and how logic constrains how science put together. Another thing Peirce invented, just a little thing that he invented, was logic, formal logic. He's the inventor of formal logic with quantifiers, first and second order, or propositional logic and first order logic, and he developed actually a series of graphs called existential graphs, which represent a proof procedure for formal logic. And at the same time, a younger guy called Gottlob Frege was invented a different type of logic, but they did a lot of the same things. And if you pick up Principia Mathematica, you see Russell and Whitehead thank Frege for his logic, but throughout the book they only use Peirce's logic, which is kind of interesting. So there are so many smart people in the world who don't get a privilege of having something like this, and I'm probably not even one of them. But I really want to thank you all for coming, and I really am happy for this experience, and I look forward to seeing these papers, which as soon as I get copies of them, I'm going to start mailing to people, and I'll probably send Noam a copy of all these things, but not really. He has enough issues to worry about. So thank you very much.